Good morning. All right. I hope everybody brought their Bibles today. We're going to church. We should always have our Bibles, whether it be on the phone or whether it be in your hands. Bibles are a good thing. Okay. So for this morning's presentation, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about something very important. The beginning of the world. We're going to be talking about creation. So when we're talking about creation, there are some other theories that exist, namely evolution. So evolution versus creation. Differences between the two. Creation teaches that God created everything, that the earth is young, that each species is uniquely its own, and that God is going to eventually come back. Evolution teaches God doesn't exist, that the earth is very, very old, that species evolved from one another, and that everything is just going to keep on going on. There's nothing that's going to change. It's all going to be eventually atoms and molecules, and the entire world will just exist as is. Then there's this sneaky little thing that's crept in. If evolution wasn't bad enough, there's this sneaky little thing called intelligent design theory. And this theory takes a little bit of creation, a little bit of evolution, stirs it in the pot, and serves it up and says, oh, here's a compromise. Now, a compromise is a good thing. No. What happened in the Bible whenever they compromised on religion and beliefs? It ended up being the thing. In the book of Kings, you'll be reading through, and so was a good king. We have no information about that king. It just says, and so was a good king, and all his deeds are recorded in the books, but he neglected to do one thing, and he neglected to take out this group over here. He neglected to do this, and they let the high places be. It says he was a good king. We have none of his good deeds, but that one failure of his is listed there for all of us to see. So this is like taking a little bit of poison and mixing it in with the good grape juice, and then stirring the pot and saying, here, have a sip. Will it still kill you? Yes. Maybe not as quick, but it'll be a lingering death. So intelligent design teaches that there was a higher power, and it's basically an insert your choice. You want to say that it's this one over here? Fine, put that name here. You want to say it's this religion over here? Fine, and insert religion or God of choice. So they set everything into motion a very, very, very long time ago, and that it slowly, the process of evolution has occurred over the course of time, and that higher power really has taken a back seat and doesn't really care, and it's just letting everything come as it will and be as it may. So, and then everything is just going to continue. Those higher powers really don't care, and they're not coming back. So it's not a very good idea. So if you ever see anybody say, oh, well, here's a religious substitute for or alternative to evolution, you see intelligent design, run. It's a poisoned apple. All right, Bible says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And through faith, we understand that the worlds, notice the plural? Amen. The worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are made of things which do not appear. Now, when we're looking at our bodies, what are we looking at? Skin. But what is skin made up of? Cells. Can we see ourselves right now? If I was to get a microscope and I was to zoom in on my skin, I would see the individual cells. But then if I got an electron microscope, I could zoom in even further and see little itty bitty molecules and microbes. And eventually, if I keep zooming in, I'm going to get to these things called atoms. And that is what everything is made up of. They supposedly did not know about atoms back in Bible times, yet Paul is writing and saying, things not seen. Everything is made up of things that are not seen. So they knew about atoms long before we discovered atoms, which was actually in the 20th century. All right, science in the Bible. There's one place in the Bible where it talks about science. It says, keeping to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called. Some versions translate the word science there as knowledge, but it comes down to the same thing, the education. So there's false science. If there's false science, what does that imply? That there's true science. So a lot of people accuse people that believe in the Bible of being science deniers. No, we want to get to the root of the actual true science, not denying science, but we want to get accurate science. So there's a lot of science in the Bible. It says the earth, we just read, the earth is made up of invisible things, and that there's multiple planets, not just this planet. Job 26:7. So we're going to turn to Job, verse 26, verse 7. He stretched out the north over the empty place and hangeth the earth upon nothing. Now, this is really, really interesting. So Job, who knows when Job was written? Who wrote the book of Job? Moses. So Job occurred before Moses. We actually, when we're going through, and this goes back to our timelines that we did last night, but when you're going through and you're looking at the 70 nations that came from Noah, there's a list called the Table of Nations. You can see some of the names that are mentioned in Job as some of the people that are attacking Job. When you're looking at the genealogy of Abraham's children, how many times is Abraham married? He was married twice, but he also had a concubine after Sarah died, whose name was Keturah. And he had 6 sons with Keturah. So Abraham actually had 8 sons. Most people only know of Ishmael and Isaac, but there was actually an additional 6 sons that came after Isaac that then intermarried with not only Ishmael, they also intermarried with some of Isaac's family. And when you're looking at who Job is talking to, and this could be a whole presentation on itself, but when you're looking at who Job's friends are, Job's friends and the people that he's talking with are all of Ishmael's descendants and Keturah's descendants. So Job is occurring sometime after Abraham, but sometime before Moses or while Moses is in the wilderness during that 40 years. So we can pinpoint Job pretty much right down to a very specific, 200-year time frame. But Job in this verse is saying that the earth hangs on nothing. Do you know what a prominent mythological belief that comes from this time frame is? You ever heard of a guy named Atlas? Yeah. Mm-hmm. What does Atlas do? He's always sitting there and he's got the world sitting on his shoulders like this. Another common belief that comes out of that time, you'll see the world on the back of a turtle or on the back of an elephant. So all of the mythology that's coming from the nations that are surrounding the people of God is all saying that the world rests on something. And then Job comes along, and Job is saying, hey, guess what? The earth doesn't sit on anything. It just kind of hangs there. That was a revolutionary concept for that particular time period in history. Then we have the oceans. Okay, the oceans is a remnant of the flood, which we will learn about later this evening, or later this afternoon. I'm already thinking it's afternoon. But the oceans, the Bible says in Psalms and in 2 Samuel that the oceans have paths. What are paths in an ocean? Currents. So it actually says, hey, guess what? The ocean has currents. This was not a concept that was developed until several thousand years later. The ocean has valleys and mountains and springs, according to Jonah. He should know. He could have went, he took a little trip. And it must have felt like, oh, we're going up a mountain. Oh, we're coming down. We're in the valley now. But according to Jonah and Job, again, the ocean has these mountains, these valleys, these springs. Nobody knew that the ocean had springs and mountains and valleys in it until very recently when they were actually able to send little bots down there and sonar to actually see these things. These are concepts that they were writing about that the Bible has had for thousands of years that are actually very modern concepts that we've been able to see. Air, the fact that it has weight. This is in Ecclesiastes and in Job, the weight and the current of air. You know, looking up at the sky, would they have known that air had a specific current? It was just whichever way the wind blew, according to everybody else. But God's people knew that there are some currents and that air actually weighs something. And then if you look in Amos and Psalms and Ecclesiastes, and you're reading all of these different parts and you put it all together, it's actually describing the hydraulic cycle for water. So they knew about the hydraulic cycle, and they were referencing parts of that. The fact that the earth was circular in shape. A lot of people believe that back in ancient times, they thought that the world just dropped off. That's actually a myth. Most people didn't believe that, but they didn't understand the true size of the earth. But it's mentioned that the earth is circular in shape, that there's fire under the ground. What do we call fire under the ground? Magma. The fact that each star is different. I mean, you look up in the sky, can you tell that the stars are all different? Some are brighter. You know, you get that big, like when you're looking at a light bulb, it just kind of all blurs together and you have that fuzz around it. But with our telescopes now, we know that each star is different. They're different colors based on the temperature that the star burns. We did not know that, or supposedly they did not know that back then. We've recently found that out, but they wrote about it in the Bible. Same thing with sand, the grains of sand. If you look at grains of sand, each one is unique and has beautiful shapes. Blood is the code of life. What's inside of your blood? DNA. Your DNA is inside of your blood. It's also inside of your cells. So when you're looking at your cells, it's there. But the DNA, without blood, your body is basically useless. So it not only carries the code of life, but it is your life that goes through you, courtesy of God's breath. I want to make that clear. Your blood would just sit there and do nothing if God hadn't breathed into you. All right, bodies turn to dust. That could be observed. So that's an observable fact that everybody knew. Running water reduces bacteria. A lot of people back then, they knew that running water, that was the best way to go because it would keep it flowing. You didn't want that old nasty stagnant water. Quarantining the ill, that's something that's been done for a very long time. That's a biblical belief that has recently popped back up. So, now we get into some lovely pictures. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That shouldn't be a question. That should be a fact. Okay, let's look at some scientific stuff about the creation. So thermodynamics, the laws of thermodynamics. The first law, there's a lot of writing on this page, but summarized, it states that energy, lots and lots of energy. It does not matter how that energy is exerted. That energy will be all over the place. When that energy is exhausted, the energy then reverts back to its original form and cycles back again. So simply put, the first law of thermodynamics, if you think of it in terms of a child, it is the daily activities of a child. Energy, exerting the energy at rest, energy reverts back to its original form. So, based on the laws of thermodynamics, it is impossible for one form of energy to morph or turn into another form of energy. Guess what we are considered? we are considered a form of energy. We are the form of energy in the form of human beings. A bunny rabbit is in the form of energy of a bunny rabbit. According to the laws of thermodynamics, energy cannot change form. It must revert back to its original form. So first law of thermodynamics completely tosses out the idea of evolutionary something becoming something that it is not. And getting into something from nothing, I need 2 volunteers. Well, I see 1 volunteer. Do I have another volunteer? Come on. Okay. So, can you hold this lovely flower for me? And you're going to hold this bag. All right. So, we're going to look at this screen here. We have a bag. Okay? So, assume that we're going to put these letters inside of that bag, and we are going to try to pull out. I called you up here just a second too early. Can you sit in that front row real quick so you can see the screen better? There you go. All right. If I were, this is the second law of thermodynamics, and it's spontaneity. If I were to mix up all the letters of the alphabet, put them in this bag, and then try to pull out the letters to form the word creation, what do you think my probability of doing that is? In any way, shape, or form. I could pull out an N, then a T, then a C. What do you think the probability is? The probability is unlikely, but it's 1 in 62.9 billion. That is just for the letters in the word creation. In any way, shape, or form. What if I were to say, if I were to pull it out in not alphabetical order, but in word order? If I were to pull it out in exactly the word, I pull out a C, and then an R, and then an E, an A, a T, an I, an O, and an N, that probability would be 403 septillion for 8 letters. Okay, chromosomes, a human has 46 pair of 46 chromosomes, 23 pair. Always. All right, that's just one person. So the probability of getting the correct chromosomes in the correct order is this high number, which is almost considered an impossibility. There are 8 billion people. Evolution says that we go simple to complex, but if we were going simple to complex, so one-celled organisms would be at the bottom and then going to the top. But the thing is that the one-celled organisms, the amoebas that they say that we came from, actually have more chromosomes than we do. So technically, according to the theory of evolution, an amoeba should be smarter than us. Top that off, a fern, the ultimate goal of evolution, we want complex, simple to complex. Ferns have 1,260 chromosomes. Ferns should be the ultimate evolutionary achievement, which supposedly happened billions of years ago, so the whole past 4 billion years of human evolution, according to their theories, should be useless because the ultimate was to go simple to complex, and ferns are the most complex chromosomes that we have. So the fact that we have chromosomes and amoebas with more chromosomes than we do proves that their concept of simple to complex does not hold water. All right, now I need the bags. Okay, come on up here. All right. Oh, that's all right. It's just a demonstration anyway. It's a wonder I got it here. I'm a klutz. I drop everything, so. It's close enough. Okay. So we'll just put those right there. All right, so put the flower right there so everybody can see the flower. So here are some random pieces of Legos. There we go, random Lego pieces. Show everybody the bag. There's nothing in there. Turn it upside down, give it a good shake. All right, take 2 of those random pieces, take 2 of the gray pieces, and put them inside that bag. There you go. All right, now close the lid of that bag and give it a good shake. Shake, 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 shake. All right. Now look inside that bag. What do you think you're going to see inside that bag? The two gray Legos that we put in there. Two green blocks should give us 2 green blocks, right? All right. Now, look inside. Make sure that verify that there's 2 gray pieces in there still. You see them? All right. If I took one of those gray pieces out, take a gray piece out and put a different color in, any color you want. You want pink? Put a pink one in there. All right, put it in there, shake it up. What is the probability that I'm going to get a one that's red? We put a pink one in, we put a gray one in. What's the possibility of getting a red one? 0. You sure? Just one red block? I mean, I've got 2 in there. Surely we could get a red one out of there. There's no red? All right. What about one of these critters? No. But I've got the blocks in there. Put them all in. Put them all in. Give it a good shake. Give it a nice good shake. Am I ever? You could sit there for a million years. Are you ever going to get a little dude out of there? No. You sure? It'd have to be magic. What if? So what we see here, our lovely little flower. All of the blocks inside of this bag will make this flower. So let's just open the bag. Here, you want to pour these into that bag? We have all of the components that we need. Every single last piece. They're all in there? All right, now close that bag and give it a good shake. All right, what's the possibility that I'm going to reach in there and pull out that flower? Ready to go. We can't even keep that flower together now, and we haven't given it a good shake. No. We're never going to get this, no matter how long you sit there. What? It takes a what? It takes a creator to assemble the pieces. Thank you very much. You may go sit down now, and you may have the flowers if you would like them. You may need these. There you go. So if we shake something up, if we drop it and stomp on it and explode it, what are we more likely to have? A mess. So the laws of thermodynamics says that we're more likely to go from order to chaos or chaos to order. Order to chaos because you have to have something guiding it. If you don't have something guiding it and something putting forth actual effort, you're not going to get order. Everything is just going to go boom. So no matter how long you sit there and you shake that bag up, you will never in a million years get what you want. It will change maybe. It will wear down. If you throw a bunch of rocks inside of a rock tumbler, what happens? They get polished, but the rough edges go away and they get smaller. And eventually, if you left them in there long enough, they'd just turn into nothing. They would just be sand and it'd just sit there and be slush. It wouldn't be a rock anymore. So, we've proven through the laws of thermodynamics that evolution is impossible. Let's look at some scientific dating. There's our lovely little protons and neutrons. All right, so now we're getting into the zeroth law of thermodynamics. So, zeroth law says that if we have 2 objects that are in equilibrium with one another, and that they're also an object with a third object, and they're all in equilibrium, that they must all be in equilibrium. You can't have one without the other. How does this work? What's water? Water is H2O. One hydrogen for 2 oxygen. 2 hydrogen for 1 oxygen, H2O. Yes?
Would scientific dating end up with better marriages?
I don't know. Haven't tried it. So carbon-14, who's heard of C14 dating? Carbon-14 dating. or radiocarbon dating. They use it for everything. So carbon-14 dating is presumed to be in equilibrium with oxygen and carbon-12. That means that for every X amount of carbon molecules, yeah, just take all the pieces there.
I don't need this
Yeah,
many.
here's another one.
I don't need this many.
There you go. So carbon-14 is supposed to be in equilibrium. That means that for every carbon-14 molecule, that there is a certain amount of oxygen molecules and a certain amount of carbon-12 molecules in its original state. As time goes on, carbon-14 decays, but carbon-12 does not decay, and oxygen remains the same. So if we're looking at a sample that has X amount of carbon-14, and we're looking at the ratios, which is 1 carbon-14 molecule to 1 trillion carbon-12 molecules, and we're seeing 2 carbon-14s, then we know that something has gone wrong in the equation. We can figure out, based on this, what supposedly the age of an artifact or an item is. And it has to be done on something that was living at one point. It can't be a rock. Rocks don't have carbon-14. So we're talking organic matter. Organic matter would be what? Plants. Anything that has any type of tissue. So plants, animals, humans. All of this is going under the assumption that the oxygen that we are currently breathing, that the oxygen that is currently in the air, has been consistent since the dawn of time. Now, what is the one thing that when you're looking and they're saying, 80 billion years ago, this thing happened and the earth was this lush tropical forest? What's the one thing that they tell you about oxygen in this lush tropical forest that the dinosaurs were supposedly roaming? Higher levels of oxygen. So based on their own admission, the planet at one point had much higher levels of oxygen. And then they turn right around and say, carbon-14 dating is accurate, but carbon-14 dating is based on the assumption that the level of oxygen that we currently have on the planet has been consistent and the same for all eternity. It doesn't hold water. It's imbalanced there. So when you're looking at carbon-14, it has a half-life of 5,730 years, which means that is the amount of time that if we had 6 carbon molecules, if we came back in 50 years, half of them would be gone, and in 100 years, all of them would be gone. This is not absolute accurate. This is just an example of what half-life is. That's not exactly how scientists do half-life. If a half-life is 50 years, you would assume that in 100 years, nothing would be left. They then take that remaining sample, that 50-year sample, and then they do half of that. And then when they're doing the next thing, they do half of that. And then when they're doing the next one, they do half of that until they get no samples left at all. So rather, if something says its half-life is 5,700 years, most people would assume, the entire life of this carbon molecule is 12,000 years. No, they take it back and they say anywhere between 50 and 80,000 years. Okay, let's apply that to some of the other things that they're doing. They're coming back with carbon dates that are in the hundreds of thousands of years. That is impossible based on their own science, which says that the half-life can only be between 50 and 80,000 years. So if they're coming up with a carbon date that is going beyond that, then that doesn't apply to their own logic of how they got the carbon-14 date to begin with. And then if you're familiar with Egyptology, you might recognize this gentleman. He was the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Department. If you wanted to dig in Egypt at all, you had to go through him. He does not like the fact that anybody would assume that the Israelites were in Egypt at all, ever. So therefore, anybody that's ever dug in Egypt, if they say, hey, guess what, we found evidence of the Israelites here, he'd shut them down real fast, and they would never be an Egyptologist again. But even he said that they know that there are errors in the Egyptian chronology. They know that. They don't want to go back and fix it because they based the entire world's history based on Egyptian chronology. So if they went back through and adjusted it, they'd have to adjust the Sumerian, the Babylonian, the Assyrian, all of these, and they don't feel like doing that because it would lead to a educational timeline nightmare, which could be solved very easily if they just went with the Bible. It fits quite nicely. But even he said that carbon dating is useless, and it should not be used to date anything. Should not be used to date mummies, should not be used in chronologies, and that considered an imaginary result. Doesn't exist at all. So that's carbon-14 dating. Another type of dating that you will see used is potassium-40, argon-40, or otherwise known as potassium-argon dating. So with this, argon is a gas that is released as potassium decays. So there's an equilibrium for every amount of, as they trace how long the potassium takes to decay, they will measure how much argon gas you get from that. And they can supposedly get a date on that. So who's heard of Mount St. Helens? Mount St. Helens, big volcano, blew up. See, I keep going back to volcanoes. Volcanoes are very important. If you were here last night, you'd know what we were talking about with volcanoes. But when they test the rocks that formed from Mount St. Helens, how does a lava rock form?
Comes out of the volcano with liquid, and then as it cools, it solidifies.
Exactly. So in the magma chamber, we have all of our magma. As it rises to the surface, the minute it reaches the surface and it starts spilling onto the surface, the name changes from magma to lava. And those are the things that you see everybody running, lava's gonna get me, or, oh, this lava's moving slow, how close can I get? Let me drop something in here and watch it. But when they test the rocks, so the magma came out, slid down the mountain, cooled, they took samples, they know that the mountain went off in 1980, they know the date that the mountain went off. They know where the lava flows went. They go, they pick up the rock. They go and they test it. Dates come back 20,000 years old on a rock that formed in 1980. Same thing with New Zealand. There's a volcano that was going off from 1949 to the 1970s. And they tested multiple samples throughout the years, 270,000 to 3.5 million years. They literally watched these rocks form, and they're getting dates in the millions of years. That it is impossible for the rocks to have formed before this. Somebody once asked, well, maybe the argon was in the magma. No, the potassium is in the magma. You only get the argon when the potassium is decaying and exposed on the surface and it's solidifying. And once it solidifies, then it starts releasing the argon, and then you can get your gas numbers. So the fact that with two different volcanoes, two different studies over the course of many, many years, we can't trust these results. So when they say, Yellowstone volcano, this super volcano, it went off, X million years ago or X billion years ago, and it's gone off, every so often, and we're behind schedule on the next eruption. You can't trust those dates. One, we never saw that volcano erupt. We can't get an accurate date on ones we did see erupt. I wouldn't take my money to a bank, where I'm going there and, they say, oh, well, when you go to get your money back, you might get $10, you might get 20, you might get 200 million, or, you might owe $50. I would never put my money in a bank like that. That's the same thing that they're doing with the dating. And they expect you to put your full faith and trust in that and reject God based on a faulty theory. Then they say, oh, you can count the tree rings. They're accurate. They're reliable. This is dendrochronology. Guess what? Dendrochronology is not necessarily accurate. Sometimes it can be, but there's other times that it cannot. They took trees, sprouted the same year, grown the same place, right next to each other. Same year, same place, different number of tree rings. opposite sides of the tree. So put your finger on your nose, okay? Put your finger on the back of your head, okay? This is representing a tree, okay? If we were to do a dissection straight down the middle, and we were to count the rings from your nose to the middle of your head, and the rings from the back of your head to the middle of your head, should we get the same number of rings? Did your nose grow at the same rate as the back of your head? It kind of does. I mean, it proportionate wise here. But one tree, different number of rings on different sides based on the water levels and different things. But you shouldn't be getting that. And then you have a tree that has multiple centers. Here's a center, there's a center. Where do you start counting the rings from that one? And then when I was out west a couple of years ago, I was talking with the rangers out there, and there was a big issue about over near Yellowstone when I was talking with them, because the trees were not growing rings. It had been 3 years, and there was no visible growth at all in some of the trees. So there was at least 3 years, no growth. Normally, thin little line, you could tell that there was a, drought, but these were showing absolutely nothing. And they're like, we have to mark this down, and because this is an anomaly, this is not good. So it doesn't always match up. So don't rely on dendrochronology. Don't rely on rock dating. Don't rely on carbon-14 dating. Rock dating is something that they use oftentimes for dinosaur bones. They don't date the bones themselves because they said, the bones are too old to have carbon in them. So we're not going to date the bones, we'll date the rocks that the bones were found around. And so it's circular logic. All right, the moon. How does the moon prove creation? What day was the moon made? The fourth day. The moon proves creation because guess what? Gravity is actually pushing the moon away from us. Gravitational pull, every time it goes around, it actually causes the moon to move further away from us every time it happens. So in the past 6,000 years, the moon has actually moved 800 feet further away from us as time goes on. If we follow that same, if we go, in the past 6,000 years, it's moved 800 feet, let's go back a little. Let's see how close the moon was to the earth. So if you follow that trajectory, we actually find that the moon, according to the theory of evolution, would have actually been orbiting inside of the planet for 2 billion years. And there would have been a global flood. They deny a global flood ever happened. Not only would there have been a global flood, there would have been a global flood twice a day for billions of years. So the moon not only proves creation, but it also proves somewhat the flood. All right. Transitional animals. What day were critters like this made? There's a debate. It's either day 5 or 6. Little amphibians and bugs. They were made same week as we were. Whether it be the same day or the day before, we're relatively the same age. Guess what? Are these transitions? This is a gecko. That is a modern gecko. This is a gecko that was encased in amber, probably during the flood or near the flood. This is a snail. That is a snail shell fossil. There is literally no evidence of change with these animals. They are identical. They actually once did a carbon dating testing on a snail shell, and it came back that the snail was a couple million years old, or a couple thousand years old. It's like, oh, wow. Hello, Methuselah. All right. No transitional animals. These are the famous finches. Well, guess what? If you applied that same logic to humans, it's the shape of their beak made them a different species. It's called genetics. Still human, regardless of the shape of your nose or the shape of your ears, you're still human. Same thing works with finch beaks. They're still finches. It's just genetics. It has nothing to do with them evolving into a different species. All right? What day were birds made? Day 5. All right? What came first? It's the age-old question. The chicken or the egg? All right, because the Bible says that God made them to fly about. And when God says something's going to fly about and make it happen, it instantly appears. But did you know that recently they did a scientific test and they found out that a chicken egg cannot exist in of itself. It has to have a protein, and this protein is called OC17. And it is only found in adult female chickens. The egg is then coated in this protein and laid. Without this protein, the egg falls apart. So therefore, eggs cannot exist without an adult female chicken. So scientifically speaking, the chicken came first. All right, question for you. They say we came from apes. Okay? Are there cavemen in the Bible? Do we see cavemen in the Bible?
No.
Well, it depends on how you define cavemen. There's several cavemen in the Bible, but they weren't necessarily dumb. Right. So, first caveman that we see in the Bible is who? Lot. Lot left the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I've actually got some sample of sulfur. I was not going to bring it in here because it can be very smelly if it gets on your hands. But he left Sodom and Gomorrah. He went to where? He went to Zor. He got scared. He's like, oh boy. He left there. Where did he go? A cave. He was living in a cave. Then we see who? David. He was living in what? Caves. He was living in a cave, and who came along? Saul came along, and David thought, I'm going to be a little rotten thing. Sneak up and, cut that little fabric piece, and then like, hey, Saul, I could have got you, but I didn't. Then we have Elijah. Elijah lived in a cave. Where was Elijah's cave? Elijah's cave was on Mount Sinai. I can show you pictures later if you'd be interested in seeing the cave of Elijah and the view that he had. The view that he had would have been where the encampment area was. And he could have seen the whole thing straight from his cave. Who had 100 prophets in a cave by 50s? It was a prophet, same time as Elijah. Who was the queen during Elijah? Jezebel. Jezebel ordered that the prophets of God be what? So a prophet named Obadiah went and took the prophets by 50s and hid them in caves. So those are the cavemen in the Bible. So people say, oh, cavemen aren't in the Bible. Well, cavemen actually are in the Bible, just not, how they think of cavemen. And they've actually proven that what they thought cavemen are like actually is inaccurate because they go into these caves. They've been looking at some of the bones and the tools and find out that they're actually very sophisticated. So they're having to rewrite the narrative of what they thought cavemen were like. We don't have to rewrite the Bible. If you have to rewrite your theory, there might be a problem with it. All right, then we get to man. The humankind. Made on which day? The sixth day. And first we had who? Adam. Then we had Eve. Where was Eve from? The rib of Adam. We can actually prove this from medical information and medical science. So God caused a sleep to fall upon Adam. Everybody's like, oh, Adam didn't have a whole rib side. No, he still had his rib cage. What's the rib cage for? protect your internal organs. They're living for 900 years. Adam did not need to go walking around, 900 years with no protection on his rib or his lungs and kidneys. But there is a little section right down here. These last little ribs down here, there is a sheath. It's a dense sheath of tissue that surrounds that rib, and it's called the perichondrium. I know I butchered that name. But they can actually take that. That area has stem cells. If they do not mess with that dense sheet of tissue and the cartilage and damage it, they can actually remove the rib bone, and they can use it for facial reconstructions. If there's been like a major accident and somebody needs, like a jaw or nose or something like that, the rib bone will regrow. They actually have the stuff, and I didn't include that slide today because I wanted to conserve time, but they actually have the CT scan images of where they've removed the rib bone and then the progressive growth patterns as it comes back, and the rib will regrow itself. It is the only bone in the human body that will regenerate if lost. It's the very, very bottom. Yeah, the bottom ones. And there are stem cells that surround that rib. And what a stem cell will do is stem cells are uncoated. Most of the cells in your body, like the skin cells, they're coated. They're like, our job's skin. Go to skin. And your heart muscles and your heart cell, our job is heart. Our job's kidney, our job's liver. And then you have these poor little cells that are sitting there just waiting. They're like, what shall we be today? I'm like, we're a rib. Okay, boys, get to work. So we have only bone in the body that will regrow itself if you lose it, and it is the rib bone, which proves creation. Then we have more genetics with the cells. So we're talking about cells and DNA. So the DNA that's unique to you is located in that yellow area. That's called the nucleus. That's unique to you and your identical twin. That is what makes you you. But inside these kidney bean looking things that are green with the squigglies in them, those are called mitochondria, and they're the powerhouse of the cell. So your body eats food, turns that food into sugars. Sugars go to those mitochondria, and they're like, yeah, let's power on. And they provide all of the energy that the cells need. The mother passes these down to all of her children. Her mitochondria cells are the same mitochondria cells as her mom's, are the same mitochondria cells as her mother's, and you can trace these all the way back. Now, every so often there's a mutation, and that's where we get different variations of mitochondria. Same thing with men. So when we're looking at the nuclear DNA, we're looking at the nucleus now. These are your chromosomes. These are your nucleotides. If one of these gets switched, that's called I had the name 2 seconds ago. If they get switched, that's it. Thank you. It's a mutation, and that's what it can be tracked. And that's how you know certain families. Certain families have certain patterns, and this is what they're comparing when they're doing DNA tests. They're looking at the patterns and how many patterns that they have. And if the patterns are extremely close, they can say, you are 99.99% related. And then they can go further back and say, yes, you're related, but you're only like 60%, until they can't do that anymore. But men, if we're looking at the chromosomes, this Y chromosome right here, that is the same as, so every guy here, you are carrying your father's Y chromosome, and his father's Y chromosome, and his father's Y chromosome, and you could trace those Y chromosomes all the way back. So you end up with what scientists call Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve, because they've actually been able to trace these chromosomes and mutations all the way back to 2 people. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. They can trace back the female line further than they can trace back the male line. So they say mitochondrial Eve is older than Y chromosome Adam. Why would that be based on the Bible?
Adam's rib made Eve.
Yes, but they're saying that Eve's mitochondria is older than Adam's.
Because women have babies.
Well, no. Good guess. Think of an event in the Bible. The flood. All men in the world came from whom? Noah. They do come from Adam, but every male currently on this planet is a descendant of Noah. So when we're looking at the Y chromosomes, whatever Noah had in his genetics is what was passed to his 3 sons, and therefore, so Noah's Y chromosome was passed to his 3 sons. Any genetic variation from that point would be back on the sons' lines, and they can trace it back to an original source. And the original source, the pattern that appears in every single one, traced back to one man, one original gene, one original source, would have been Noah. Every man on the planet goes back to Noah. Of Adam eventually, but whatever Noah's genetics were. So Noah may have had mutations himself, but those mutations were then encoded as the base, like the original source. We're just picking up original source here, and they copied from there and reproduced. Whereas it was traditionally thought that Noah's sons married 3 sisters. So 3 brothers found another family that had 3 girls. They married 3 sisters. That is fallacy. Through mitochondrial DNA. Through the mitochondrial DNA, we know maybe 1 or 2 of them were sisters. But we have to go back further and further and further to get to an original source of mitochondrial DNA for the women. So mitochondrial Eve actually very well may be Eve herself or one of Eve's daughters, whom all of the 3 girls descended from. But all of the men on the planet, Y chromosome Adam, is actually Noah, all the way down here. So that would explain, the flood explains why the men's line, we can trace it back as far as the flood, but the female line, because the girls weren't sisters, their mothers were, you have to go further back and trace the maternal lines back further to actually get to one source. And that is most likely Eve herself. So Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve prove creation, 2 original sources for males and females, but it also proves or helps prove the flood genetics because the lines differ in ages and you can go back more mutations, which they consider like generations, than female line. All right. The original dragons. So snakes, when they were originally made, had what? Wings. They had wings. They had what? Feet. They had legs and feet. Bible says, upon thy belly thou shalt go. That was his punishment. It's like, no more flying, no more walking. You are crawling. Josephus says the snake was deprived of his feet and poison put in his mouth because it was with his mouth that the poison of sin spread. This is a tradition that went on. If we look at fossils, we know that snakes, even today, have the capability of having legs. There are snakes that look at this little red area, that little red circle. He's got stubby little legs. These are a mutation. There's a gene called the sonic hedgehog gene. It exists in every single snake. It is turned off. But if something happens and it gets flipped back on during development, it doesn't get flipped back on all the way. What you end up with are stubby little protrusions that are basically useless. They can't do anything with them. But it proves that snakes are capable of having legs. But that, for some reason, that gene, it exists, but it's been switched off, which proves the curse of the snake, upon thy belly thou shalt go. God left him with the capability to have legs, but he just doesn't have it. And he'll end up with these stubby little protrusions that kind of stick out, but they're useless. Also, if you go to the Gray Fossil Site dig in near Johnson City, they've actually found fossilized snake skeletons. But this is a modern snake skeleton. This is the fossilized. There's extra projections for muscle attachments, big, heavy muscle attachments. Why would a snake need big, heavy muscle attachments on its back? For the wings. So the fossilized bones that they're finding at this site in the Gray Fossil Site actually proves that snakes had the capability of having these humongous muscle projections on their backs for wing attachments. All right. So then I also get asked this question a lot. So we're talking about creation. Where's the Garden of Eden? So does the Garden of Eden exist right now? Garden of Eden exists in heaven. It was taken to heaven before the flood. But where was it when it was on earth? I've heard lots of different ideas on where it is. Where do you think the Garden of Eden was located? If you have to, I hear Babylon. I heard Saudi Arabia. I hear Mesopotamia. I've heard a lot of people say Africa, and that's why we have the Sahara Desert. But that's to go with the out of Africa theory, which is an evolutionary theory that all life, the cradle of life, if you've heard that term, that's the theory that all life originated in Africa, which is actually incorrect, because after the flood, all life originated where? Come this afternoon, you'll find out. Up in Mesopotamia. So genetically speaking, when you're looking, we actually have the most genetic variation in Mesopotamia, not in Africa. Africa has very little. Africa, South America, North America, very little genetic variation when you're looking at haplogroups. The most haplogroups that you get are actually in Central Asia and along the European border. It's Mesopotamia. So Garden of Eden. Bible says that Eden means pleasure or delight. When you're looking at the definition in a dictionary on what the Hebrew word Eden means, it was placed in the New World, but the garden specifically, a lot of people confuse the land of Eden with the Garden of Eden. Two different things. The garden was specifically to be Adam and Eve's home, so the region was called Eden. The garden was placed in the region, but in the east of that particular region, according to Genesis. The land of Nod, which Cain went to, was then east of that. So you have the region of Eden, bordered by the region of what was eventually called Nod, and sitting near the border, we have what was the Garden of Eden. And out of the garden went one river that became four. You have the Pison, the Gihon, the Hiddekel, and the Euphrates, which actually, the Euphrates is actually listed as Parath. If you look at the Hebrew, the original Hebrew actually says Parath, translated as Euphrates. Hiddekel, the Assyrian, Armenian, and Syriac and Aramaic. There we go. For Tigris is actually Dekel. So Hiddekel is a form of Dekel, which is Hiddekel and Tigris. So Tigris and Euphrates, hands down, we know where they are today. Gihon is assumed to be the Nile, and the Pihon, nobody knows. They argue it up one side and down the other. All right, let's look at where, and this is all assuming that the four rivers that are named didn't disappear during the flood, because we're talking lots of environmental changes during the flood. So when we're looking at the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, as Moses describes it, Moses says he gives the current geography of the area and says that the Tigris ran along the east of Assyria, and I forget what he said for the Euphrates, but Tigris east of Assyria, it originates all the way up near Turkey. The Euphrates actually originates from two different points, two different main springs, but the actual head of the Euphrates starts actually quite near the Tigris in Turkey. So which direction does the Tigris and Euphrates flow? Do they flow to the Persian Gulf or away from the Persian Gulf? To the Gulf. Okay. When we're looking at our map, which way does the Nile River flow? To the Mediterranean or away from the Mediterranean? To the Mediterranean. So if we're looking at the Bible, it says that the Garden of Eden, 4 rivers came from it, or one river was there, and then it divided into 4 heads. We know where the Euphrates and the Tigris descended from, going to the Persian Gulf. The Nile doesn't even touch that. It comes from the mountains down here in near Kenya and Ethiopia and goes through Africa up to the Mediterranean Sea. It is nowhere near the headwaters for the Tigris and Euphrates. So either the rivers have been misidentified or the world looked a lot different. But based on the descriptions that Moses gives, it actually would appear that the land of Cush was actually at the point at which Moses is talking about is not necessarily the land of Cush that we now know down in Egypt. They were still settling those regions and those areas, and there are multiple places that have the same name. So when Moses is saying the land of Cush and the land of Havilah, there's actually 2 people or 3 people that meet these qualifications in the Table of Nations that are actually up closer to Mesopotamia. So Tigris and Euphrates, we know where they are, but we don't have any absolutes on where the Garden of Eden itself stood. Based on where we know the Tigris and Euphrates originate, my best guess would be somewhere in Turkey, in Mesopotamia. But short of identifying the locations that Moses was talking about, we don't absolutely know for certain. Where it used to stand, we know where it is now and where it will be eventually. And that's what matters. All right. Any questions? You have a question? No? Okay. Did you want to have closing prayer and song? Okay. All right. So, bow your heads. Lord, just want to thank you for allowing us to be here today and going over your word and learning the scientific facts in the Bible, and be with us as we prepare to open your word even further and learn more about giants, and be with us as we study and as we go into this afternoon's program. And for those that can't be here for this afternoon, please be with them as they travel and they go about their week until we can all return to you again next week. In your name we pray, amen.